When we think of pirate treasure, most people picture a tattered map with a big red X, a chest overflowing with gold, and swashbuckling captains hiding their loot under palm trees. But behind the fantasy lies one of history's most enduring mysteries, the lost treasure of Cocos Island. Here's the shocking part. For more than 200 years, men have risked their lives, their fortunes, and even their sanity searching for it. And one expedition, beginning in the early 1900s, stretched across 17 relentless years, a hunt that nearly broke the men who believed Cocos held the key to unimaginable riches. But where did this legend begin? Cocos Island, a remote volcanic island in the Pacific Ocean, about 550 kilometers off the coast of Costa Rica, has long been shrouded in myth. In the early 1800s, whispers spread among sailors of treasure, buried deep within its dense jungle and hidden coves. These weren't just coins or jewels. The stories spoke of entire fortunes looted by pirates during the golden age of piracy. One of the most famous names tied to Cocos is Captain Benito Bonito, a ruthless pirate who supposedly hid millions in stolen gold on the island around 1820. Others claim that treasures from Lima, hauled away when Spanish officials tried to protect the riches of Peru during independence revolts in 1821, were smuggled out and buried in Cocos' soil. Imagine it, chalices of gold, altars dripping with emeralds and countless silver ingots, all waiting beneath the earth. By the late 19th century, the legend had grown so powerful that adventurers from Britain, America, and Germany sailed across the world just for a chance to dig into the jungle floor. Newspapers of the time fueled the frenzy, publishing reports of ghost chests and men who swore they saw glints of gold before the jungle swallowed their dreams. But the truth is this: none of it was ever confirmed. Not a single chest has been recovered from Cocos, and yet that uncertainty, that tantalizing possibility, was enough to lure generation after generation to the island. Think about it. In an age before satellites and GPS, men packed shovels, dynamite, and blind hope, believing they could outwit nature and history itself. They weren't just chasing gold, they were chasing immortality, the chance to be the one who solved the riddle of Cocos Island. And here's where our story begins. In the early 1900s, a group of determined men set their sights on Cocos, convinced they would succeed where countless others had failed. 17 years of sweat, storms, hunger, and heartbreak lay ahead of them. They believed they were on the edge of fortune. What they didn't know was that this island, beautiful, lush, and silent, would test them harder than any battlefield. This wasn't just a treasure hunt. It was the slow unraveling of human endurance. Imagine this. It's the year 1904, and after weeks at sea, a crew of weary treasure hunters finally sees the dark silhouette of Cocos Island rise out of the Pacific mist. For days they have battled waves, sickness, and doubt. But now, there it is, a paradise so lush and green it looks like it was painted by the gods themselves. The men lean over the ship's railing, squinting against the salt wind. At first glance, Cocos doesn't look like a cursed place. It looks like Eden. Towering cliffs draped in green waterfalls, tumbling straight into the sea, a canopy so thick it seems impenetrable. Birds wheel overhead, and the air is alive with the roar of unseen rivers. To the untrained eye, this is paradise. But to the men standing on deck, hearts pounding, this is the island that has swallowed lives, fortunes, and dreams for over a century. Since the early 1820s, countless ships had anchored here, all seduced by the same promise, unimaginable riches buried beneath the soil. From the legendary Lima treasure of 1821, supposedly carried off by Captain William Thompson on the ship Mary Dear, to the fabled hoards of Benito Bonito, Cocos had become synonymous with wealth beyond imagination. It wasn't just another island. It was the island, the final resting place of millions in stolen Spanish gold, jewels, and religious relics. The men stepping onto its shores in the early 20th century knew this history. They had heard the stories in Panama taverns, seen the crude maps passed down like holy relics, and read accounts of other expeditions. Some came with real charts, supposedly traced back to pirates themselves. Others relied on fragments of rumor, but all of them believed that the jungle hid something. As their boots sank into the wet sand of Chatham Bay, the first landing site for many treasure hunters, the illusion of paradise quickly began to shift. The humidity hit them like a wall. The cries of monkeys echoed from the forest. Every inch of land seemed alive, vines coiling like snakes, roots twisting up from the ground, and insects that descended in clouds, biting without mercy. This wasn't just an island, it was a fortress, and the jungle was the first line of defense. For the first few days the men moved with energy, fueled by the dream of finding the first glint of gold. They hacked at the trees with machetes, cut paths through the undergrowth, and tried to follow the maps they had brought. But very quickly they realized something chilling. Cocos Island was far larger, far denser, and far more deceptive than any paper map could capture. Rivers cut deep channels through the land, turning the soil into mud. Torrential rains falling almost daily washed away their markings, and the terrain itself seemed to change, as if the island were alive and determined to confuse them. A landmark spotted one day would vanish the next, swallowed by mist or hidden by the endless green. One explorer in 1905 described the island as a place where the earth swallows men whole. He wasn't exaggerating. Digging in Cocos wasn't like digging in soft sand. The volcanic soil was rock-hard, laced with roots thicker than a man's arm. Every attempt at excavation meant days of back-breaking labor, often for nothing, and yet the dream kept them moving. At night, as the rain hammered their tents, the men sat around fires, retelling the legends. They spoke of the Mary Deer, laden with 350 tons of treasure stolen from Lima's churches, altars, and monasteries in 1821. They whispered of Benito's chest, said to contain emeralds the size of fists. They reminded each other that others had come close, so close, only to miss by inches. Surely, they told themselves, 17 years of searching would be enough to succeed. But Cocos had its own way of testing men. The island offered beauty, yes, but also isolation. Supplies spoiled quickly in the damp heat. Tools rusted, clothes rotted on their backs, and worse, the island's silence, broken only by the crash of waterfalls, began to gnaw at the edges of their sanity. One diary from that era, found years later, spoke of the green madness, a sickness of the mind that came from staring too long into the endless jungle, from hearing nothing but the whisper of trees and the constant pounding of rain. Men became paranoid. They suspected each other of hiding gold, of digging in secret at night. And when suspicion turned to anger, the bonds of brotherhood began to crack. Still, every morning they rose and marched back into the green, machetes in hand, sweat pouring down their faces, eyes wide with the hope that today, finally today, would be the day. Think about that. Waking up each morning for years, knowing you're risking your life, but holding on because of a story of treasure buried almost a century before. That's the power of belief. That's the power of obsession. And Cocos Island thrived on that obsession. To the men who first stepped ashore in the early 1900s, this was more than a treasure hunt. It was a battle between human will and nature's indifference. A struggle not just for gold, but for survival itself. They came chasing paradise. But what they found was a jungle determined to break them. History has a strange way of repeating itself. From the Spanish conquistadors of the 1500s, who tore apart the Americas in search of El Dorado, to fortune seekers rushing to California in 1849 for gold, men have always been willing to sacrifice everything for the promise of treasure, and Cocos Island was no different. But here's the truth. Treasure hunts are rarely about gold alone. They are about obsession. Once the dream takes root, it grows like a fever, consuming everything in its path. And by the time men realize it's killing them, it's already too late. The treasure hunters who came to Cocos in the early 1900s weren't rich aristocrats chasing adventure for sport. Most were ordinary men, sailors, laborers, former soldiers, who believed fortune could change their lives forever. Back home, they had families waiting, debts piling, and dreams that seemed out of reach. A single chest of Spanish gold could erase a lifetime of struggle. So they staked everything on the island. But the island demanded more than money. It demanded their minds. Day after day they dug. The sun scorched their backs. The rain drowned their camps. And still they pressed on. When a man swings a pickaxe into stubborn volcanic rock for years without reward, something inside him begins to twist. Doubt gnaws at him. Was the map real? Did the pirates lie? Am I even digging in the right place? Yet instead of turning back, that doubt often hardened into obsession. Each failed attempt didn't kill the dream. It made the men dig harder, convinced they were only inches away. One more week, they'd say. One more month. The treasure has to be here. It's the same psychological trap that lures gamblers into losing fortunes at the table. You've already invested so much time, sweat, blood, that you can't walk away. You double down. And Cocos Island thrived on that desperation. One explorer in 1908 wrote in his journal, "I would sooner die than leave this island empty-handed." Think about that. He wasn't joking. For him, leaving meant returning to the mainland as a failure, penniless, ridiculed. Better to perish in the jungle than admit defeat. That's how powerful the legend had become. And obsession didn't just destroy individuals, it destroyed friendships, alliances, even families. Imagine two men digging side by side for years, united by hope, only to grow suspicious when one claims to have found a sign, a stone marker, a rusted tool, a hollow sound in the earth. Suddenly, trust evaporates. The friend becomes the rival. Shovels are no longer just tools, they are weapons. There are records of at least 3 expeditions in the early 20th century, ending in violence. Men accused each other of stealing maps, of hiding gold discovered in secret, of lying about the dig sites. Fistfights broke out. Knives were drawn, and in the claustrophobic, isolating environment of Cocos, paranoia spread faster than the tropical fevers that ravaged their camps. By 1910, the stories of these failed expeditions had reached Panama and Costa Rica. Sailors spoke of madmen of Cocos, treasure hunters who returned thin, sick and wild-eyed, raving about gold that was always just out of reach. Some never returned at all. The island was slowly earning a reputation, not just as a place of hidden treasure, but as a place that devoured men's souls. Why? Because obsession has no mercy. When you are consumed by a goal, everything else disappears. Food becomes secondary. Sleep is neglected. Friendships break down. Even love and family are forgotten. The men on Cocos didn't just lose years of their lives, they lost themselves. One haunting detail, a letter dated 1913 from a treasure hunter named George Butler, sent to his wife in England. He wrote, "I hear your voice in the waterfalls, but I cannot leave. The treasure is here. I feel it. Tell the children I dig for them." He never came home. That's what obsession does. It convinces you that sacrifice is noble, even when it's meaningless. It makes you believe you're on the brink of triumph, when in reality you're sinking deeper into ruin. Cocos Island wasn't just a jungle fortress. It was a mirror, reflecting the darkest side of human desire. And once men saw their reflection there, most couldn't turn away, because in the end, treasure hunts are never about gold. They're about the fire inside us, a fire that once lit can burn us alive. It was the early 1900s, and the world was changing. Steamships replaced sails, the Panama Canal was under construction, and the dream of progress swept across the seas. Yet for a handful of men, progress was not enough. They weren't chasing invention or industry, they were chasing a ghost, a pirate's ghost. The ghost of lost treasure. Cocos Island, a lonely outpost in the Pacific Ocean, lay nearly 350 miles off the coast of Costa Rica. To reach it meant braving weeks at sea, through unpredictable currents, tropical storms, and waters haunted by sharks. Yet hundreds tried, lured by whispers of buried Spanish gold. Some claimed the treasure belonged to Benito, a pirate who plundered the seas in the 1820s. Others swore it was the stolen loot of Lima's cathedral, smuggled away during the chaos of 1821, when Peru declared independence, whoever buried it. One thing was certain: the promise of untold riches kept drawing ships toward the island like moths to a flame. Imagine the moment of departure: a ragged crew standing on the dock in Punta Arenas or Panama City, loading crates of tools, ropes, pickaxes and barrels of water. The air smelled of salt and sweat. Families gathered, some with pride, others with quiet dread. Wives and children waved goodbye, not knowing if they'd ever see their men again. And as the ship pulled away, the men on deck weren't just sailing toward an island. They were sailing toward a dream so powerful it eclipsed everything else in their lives. One man wrote in 1906, "We leave the world behind us. Ahead lies fortune or death. There can be no middle road." The voyage itself was a test. The Pacific did not forgive weakness. Storms rose without warning, tearing sails and flooding the decks. Men clung to the rigging as waves smashed against the hull. Supplies spoiled. Fresh water ran low. Rats gnawed the food stores. Fever spread through cramped quarters. Yet still they pressed on, clinging to the vision of gold hidden beneath the jungle soil. And when, at last, the dark silhouette of Cocos appeared on the horizon, it must have seemed like destiny. The island rose out of the sea like a fortress: steep cliffs, tangled forests, waterfalls pouring down its volcanic slopes. A paradise at first glance, but one that hid danger in every corner. For the men arriving, it was more than land. It was hope. They anchored their ships and rowed ashore, carrying crates of tools, barrels of water, and hearts full of fire. The beach sand was soft, the air heavy with the cries of birds. Some men knelt and kissed the ground, swearing this would be the place where their lives would change forever. But fate is cruel. The island, beautiful from a distance, revealed its teeth the moment men set foot on it. Mosquitoes swarmed their camps, spreading malaria and fever. Torrential rains washed away weeks of digging. The soil was not soft but stubborn, packed with volcanic stone that shattered shovels and bent pickaxes. Food ran scarce, and always the jungle pressed closer, thick, suffocating, alive with sounds in the night that made even the bravest shiver. Still, they carried on, because every sunrise promised that today might be the day the pickaxe struck metal, the day they uncovered the chest filled with Spanish coins, silver ingots, emerald crosses, golden chalices. Hope kept them alive, but hope also kept them trapped. One explorer's diary from 1912 reads, "The men are weary, the rains do not stop, yet I cannot call an end. The treasure is here. I see it when I close my eyes. I hear it when the shovels strike stone. It is near. It must be near." And so the cycle began. Voyage after voyage, year after year. Men risked their lives to reach this island, believing their destiny waited beneath its soil. Some would vanish, some would return broken, and some would never leave. The journey to Cocos was more than a passage across the sea. It was a passage into obsession, a journey from hope to despair, from dreams to ruin. Every sail that caught the wind carried not just men, but the eternal hunger of humanity, the hunger for more. Because treasure, whether real or imagined, is never about the gold. It's about the promise. And that promise was enough to send men sailing into storms, into madness, and into graves dug by their own hands. Cocos Island was supposed to be a paradise. To those who saw it for the first time, its waterfalls shimmered like silver ribbons, its jungles breathed with life, and its beaches promised rest after endless days at sea. But beauty is often deceiving. For those who dared to hunt treasure here, Cocos was not a paradise, it was a graveyard. By the early 20th century, the island had already earned a chilling reputation. Sailors whispered of men who set foot on its shores, but never returned. Some claimed the jungle swallowed them whole. Others said madness drove them to fight among themselves, leaving bodies buried not in gold, but in shallow, lonely graves. The truth: both were often correct. The island itself was merciless. The tropical rains fell with such fury that even a single night could wash away camps, soak supplies, and leave men shivering with fever. Malaria and dysentery struck like invisible enemies, draining strength and breaking spirits. A single mosquito bite could turn a treasure hunter into a corpse within weeks. And when food supplies dwindled, desperation turned men against each other. One expedition in 1908 ended in tragedy when half the crew perished from illness before they had dug a single pit. Another in 1911 dissolved into violence when arguments over where to dig spiraled into bloodshed. The dream of gold quickly became the poison of distrust. Imagine the scene: a group of exhausted men huddled around a flickering fire, their faces hollow, their eyes restless. The jungle around them roared with insects, shrieks of unseen animals, and the pounding rain. Tensions rose with every wasted day. Who was lying? Who was holding back a map? Who had stolen food from the dwindling supplies? By dawn, knives were sometimes drawn. This wasn't just a treasure hunt, it was survival of the fittest, played out in mud and misery. And yet even as men died, more came. Newspapers in London, New York, and Berlin fanned the flames, publishing tantalizing tales of hidden treasure worth hundreds of millions in today's money. The deaths were whispered about, but the promise of fortune drowned out the warning. The island became littered with the ghosts of those dreams. Graves dug in haste, crosses fashioned from driftwood, camps abandoned to rot under vines. A handful of explorers, who survived to tell their stories, spoke of hearing voices at night, the cries of lost men carried on the wind, a reminder that the jungle keeps no secrets, only victims. One chilling account from a survivor in 1914 reads, "Cocos is not a place for men. It is alive, but not in a way we understand. The forest whispers. It watches, and it punishes. Still, men returned, because the lure of gold is stronger than the memory of death. Each new expedition believed they would succeed where others had failed. They convinced themselves they were stronger, smarter, chosen by fate. They brought better tools, sturdier ships, more maps, and left behind the same way so many had before them. Broken, empty-handed, or buried in the soil they once believed hid their fortune. And so, with every failed expedition, Cocos earned its title, the graveyard of treasure hunters, not just for the bodies it claimed, but for the hopes it devoured. 17 years of digging, sweating, and suffering would prove that the island's greatest treasure was not gold, but its cruel ability to break men. Every legend needs a villain, and for Cocos Island, that villain was Benito Bonito, a pirate so ruthless, so feared that even a century after his death, men whispered his name with dread. The story goes back to the 1820s, when Bonito prowled the Pacific with his crew, attacking Spanish ships heavy with gold and silver. He had a reputation not only for cunning, but for cruelty. Captives were said to be forced to walk the plank, and his enemies were left hanging from the rigging as warnings to others. Some called him the bloody sword of the Pacific. Others believed he was cursed, destined to live and die in violence. According to legend, Bonito's plunder was staggering: stolen church treasures, jeweled crowns, silver bars, golden chalices, and even reliquaries dripping with emeralds. But a pirate's fortune could never remain at sea forever. He needed a place to hide it, and that place, the whispers say, was Cocos Island. Sailors told tales that around 1821, Bonito anchored in one of the island's hidden coves. By torchlight, his men carried chest after chest through the jungle, burying them deep beneath volcanic stone. Some say Bonito killed the very men who dug the pits, leaving their bodies to rot over the treasure so no one else could claim it. Others insist he carved secret symbols into the rocks to mark the hiding places, symbols that only he could understand. But the legend doesn't end with treasure, it ends with blood. Bonito was eventually captured and executed. Some say in 1830, others claim later, but before his death, he cursed his treasure. Anyone who sought it, he vowed, would meet ruin. The gold would never bring fortune, only death and despair. Now imagine this: treasure hunters in the early 1900s, sitting around their campfires on Cocos, rain pounding on the tents, the jungle alive with the buzz of insects, and someone whispers the story of Benito's curse. Suddenly, every snapping twig sounds like a warning. Every failure feels like destiny. The curse becomes more than a story. It becomes a presence. Men began to believe the island itself was haunted. When tools broke for no reason, they said Benito's spirit was watching. When storms destroyed camps, they swore it was his revenge. When men vanished into the jungle and were never seen again, it was said the pirate's ghost had claimed them. The curse didn't just live in stories, it lived in their minds. A survivor from an expedition in 1916 wrote, "The treasure blinds us. We are not digging earth. We are digging graves. Each spade of soil brings us closer, not to gold but to our doom." And that's the cruel genius of the legend. It wasn't just about gold hidden in the ground. It was about fear buried in the hearts of men. Fear that no matter how hard they worked, how long they searched, or how many maps they studied, they were fighting against something larger than themselves, a curse older than their own ambition. Yet, like all powerful myths, the curse didn't drive men away. It drove them deeper, because humans, when faced with a forbidden prize, don't turn back. They chase it harder. The promise of treasure and the shadow of the curse became inseparable. To find the gold meant defeating not only the jungle, but the ghost of Benito himself. And that perhaps was the real curse, the way the legend consumed men long before the island did. By the time the 17-year expedition unfolded, the story of Benito wasn't just background noise. It was the heartbeat of the island, pushing men forward even as it destroyed them. They weren't just treasure hunters. They were challengers of fate, battling not just earth and stone, but the weight of a pirate's dying words. On Cocos Island, gold was never simply gold. It was the price of defiance. 17 years. Think about that. Not 17 days of hardship. Not 17 months of trial. 17 long, grueling years chasing shadows in the heart of a jungle that wanted nothing more than to swallow them whole. The expedition began around 1914, led by men who believed, no, who knew, that Cocos Island held the greatest treasure hoard in history. They weren't amateurs. Many had seen the maps, read the sailors' testimonies, studied the legends of Benito and the missing Lima treasure of 1821. They arrived convinced that destiny had chosen them. At first, spirits were high. The island was lush, alive and filled with promise. They cut through the dense forest with machetes, their sweat dripping into the soil, as if each drop brought them closer to gold. They spoke of the crowns of kings, the jewels of churches, the silver of empires, buried just beneath their boots. Every sunrise felt like another chance to change their lives forever. But time is a cruel teacher. Months passed, then years. The jungle seemed endless, unyielding, roots twisted like veins of iron, mocking their picks and shovels. The rains came without mercy, turning campfires to smoke and pathways into rivers of mud. Food supplies rotted, tools broke, and the men who once laughed and dreamed began to argue, their voices rising above the hum of insects and the crash of waves. By 1916, the expedition had already claimed victims. Men left, defeated. Others stayed, hollow-eyed, muttering about gold that was surely just one dig away. And those who stayed longer than they should began to change. 17 years. Imagine that length of time in your own life. Children grow to adults in 17 years. Empires rise and fall in less time. But for these men, the island became their prison. They stopped living for the world beyond Cocos. They lived only for the holes in the ground, the next clue, the possibility that tomorrow would bring the glint of gold in the dirt. The island itself seemed to feed on their obsession. Nights grew heavy with strange sounds. Owls cried like spirits. Trees groaned in the wind. Men swore they saw shadows moving in the undergrowth, eyes watching them from the darkness. Was it imagination, exhaustion, or the curse of Benito whispering to their broken minds? There are letters from 1920 scribbled in ink so faded, it's hard to read. that speak of hunger, of madness, of fights breaking out among the crew. One man wrote, "We are not companions anymore. We are wolves circling each other, waiting for one to fall." And yet they did not quit. They couldn't. Because to leave empty-handed after years of digging wasn't just failure, it was death of another kind. They had given everything, their youth, their strength, their sanity. To walk away was to admit the jungle had beaten them. And that was a truth they could not bear. Think about the weight of that decision. To keep digging even when your hands are blistered, even when your body screams for rest, even when your soul whispers that you will never find it. To wake every morning and force yourself into the same despair, driven by nothing but hope and fear. That is not adventure. That is captivity. By the mid-1920s, their numbers had dwindled. Some died of illness. Some vanished into the jungle, never to be seen again. Others simply left, broken in spirit, their dreams shattered. But a few, the most stubborn, the most haunted, remained. 17 years. 17 years of sweat in the soil, of dreams buried under mud, of lives slowly unraveling, and at the end of it all there was no glittering chest of gold, no crowning victory, only scars in their bodies, in their minds, in their souls. This was not a story of fortune found. It was a story of men undone. And yet, their obsession kept the legend alive, because even in failure they proved something powerful. The lure of treasure is not about wealth alone. It's about the hunger in the human heart. A hunger so strong it can outlast reason, outlast hope, even outlast life itself. 17 years on Cocos, 17 years chasing a dream that consumed them. And when the last man finally left, the island remained the same, silent, green, eternal, waiting, always waiting. Cocos Island was no paradise. To the men who lived there, it became a slow, grinding nightmare. Its green jungles hid no comfort. Its waters promised no mercy. And year after year, the toll it took was heavier than any treasure could repay. At first, the men believed they could endure. They brought supplies, salted meat, hard biscuits, tools for the hunt. But supplies ran out, and the island was unforgiving. By 1915, just a year into their mission, hunger had become their daily companion. The fruit trees bore little, the soil was too wild for crops, and the sea was a fickle provider. When the nets came up empty, stomachs stayed hollow. Hunger does strange things to a man. It sharpens him at first, makes him restless, determined. But then it weakens, dulls the mind, turns brothers into rivals. The men argued over scraps of food, over who had worked hardest, over who deserved the last fish. Bonds that had once held them together began to crack. By 1918, madness had begun to creep in. The isolation, the storms, the endless digging with nothing to show, it gnawed at their sanity. Some swore they saw lights flickering deep in the jungle at night, lanterns carried by unseen hands. Others whispered they heard voices, whispers in the wind, calling their names, luring them into the shadows. And when men disappeared, swallowed by the rainforest, no one knew if it was accident or choice. There are records of fights turning violent. Men who had once shared bread now raised knives against each other. One journal written in 1921 describes a bloody brawl over a map, a scrap of paper that one man believed showed the exact spot where Benito's gold was buried. By the end of the fight, the map was ruined, the ground stained with blood, and both men too injured to dig. And betrayal. Betrayal was everywhere. The treasure hunt had begun as a shared dream, but greed eats at loyalty. Men began hiding tools, burying small caches of supplies for themselves, planning to find the treasure alone and abandon the others. Trust dissolved, replaced by suspicion. Every smile looked false. Every gesture carried the shadow of deceit. The worst betrayals, though, came from the treasure itself, or rather from the idea of it. The gold promised unity, glory, and triumph. Instead, it turned men into enemies. The island did not need to kill them with storms or sickness. The promise of treasure was enough to unravel them from within. By 1923, the expedition was no longer a brotherhood, but a battlefield without weapon. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, madness hollowed their minds, and betrayal poisoned their hearts. They were no longer men chasing a dream. They were shadows of themselves, digging graves instead of treasure pits. Imagine standing there, 17 years in, your hands blistered, your body frail, your friends turned strangers. You look around and realize the island has taken everything, your youth, your strength, your sanity. And still there is no gold. This is what Cocos does. It doesn't just test a man's endurance. It breaks him. It strips him bare until nothing is left but obsession. And for many of those men, it was not the treasure that buried them. It was the island itself. If hunger and betrayal tore at the men from within, then the jungle itself was the enemy that never rested. To live on Cocos was to live inside a green prison, one with no walls, yet no escape. The rainforest on Cocos was unlike anything these treasure hunters had ever faced. Thick canopies blocked the sun, plunging them into shadow, even at midday. The air was wet, heavy, choking with humidity. Clothes clung to their skin, never drying, rotting faster than they could mend them. Boots split open, tools rusted overnight. Nothing stayed whole for long in the grasp of the jungle. And then there were the rains. Endless, merciless rains. From May to November, storms battered the island without pause. Camps flooded, tents collapsed, fires hissed into smoke. The men huddled together, teeth chattering, their food turning to mush in the downpour. When the sun returned, it did not bring relief. It brought swarms of insects, a buzzing plague that devoured their skin and carried sickness in their bites. Every step in the jungle was a battle. Roots twisted like traps beneath their feet, sending men tumbling into gullies. Vines wrapped around tools, around throats, around limbs like the hands of the island itself, refusing to let them go. The undergrowth was so dense that clearing even a few meters could take hours of exhausting labor. Progress was measured not in miles but in inches. But worse than the ground was the silence. Yes, the jungle was loud with insects, birds and the distant crash of waves, but it was the human silence that haunted them. The way the vast forest swallowed every cry, every laugh, every curse as if mocking their struggle. Men disappeared into that silence. One moment they were with the group, the next they were gone, lost in the endless green. Some stumbled back days later, half dead with hunger, their minds cracked by isolation. Others were never seen again. By 1919, the jungle had claimed more than tools and men. It had claimed their will. The endless digging through rock-hard soil, the collapsing pits, the rivers of mud that filled their trenches faster than they could empty them. All of it wore them down. One expedition log tells of a shaft dug nearly 20 feet deep, only to be swallowed by a landslide during a storm. Weeks of labor gone in minutes, their hopes buried once more. The jungle was not simply an obstacle, it was an adversary, a silent, patient predator that waited, watched and struck with indifference. Unlike hunger or madness, there was no fighting it, no bargaining. The trees did not care about their dreams. The rains did not care about their maps. The island did not care whether they lived or died. And that was the cruelest part. Imagine standing there, soaked to the bone, your stomach empty, your friends sick with fever. You swing your shovel into the dirt again and again, but the jungle swallows every effort. No treasure gleams back at you. Only mud, only roots, only silence. This was the reality of Cocos Island. It was not the gold that held them prisoner. It was the jungle, vast, endless and eternal. The island did not need bars or guards. Its very nature was enough to keep them trapped. And for 17 years, those men fought against it, until piece by piece, the island won. For every man who set foot on Cocos, one thing burned brighter than hunger, storms or fear: the maps. Those fragile scraps of paper, those sketches passed hand to hand across taverns and ports, were the compass of their obsession. Without them there was nothing. With them there was hope, even if it was false. The story of Cocos treasure was always tied to maps. From the great liner treasure of 1821, stolen during the upheaval of Peru's independence, to the cursed gold of Benito Bonito in the 1820s, sailors and pirates swore they had hidden everything on this one jungle-covered island. But when it came to where exactly the treasure lay, nothing agreed. Some maps showed caves sealed with stone. Others marked rivers that no longer flowed, trees that had long since rotted away. Some pointed to cliffs on the northern shore, others to the beaches in the south. Each map was a contradiction, and each contradiction drove the men further into madness. By the early 1900s, these treasure hunters had collected dozens of versions, each promising the true location. At night, by lantern light, they would spread them across damp wooden tables, arguing, pointing, measuring distances with trembling fingers. Men swore they saw patterns in the lines, codes in the scribbles, secrets hidden in faded ink. But the more they studied, the less they agreed. And yet the maps kept them going. When weeks of digging yielded nothing but mud, a man would suddenly produce a new label. "Look," he'd whisper, pointing at a symbol shaped like a cross. "This matches the ridge by the eastern cove. Tomorrow we dig there." And once again the camp spirits would lift. Once again they'd sharpen their shovels, haul their picks and carve a new scar into the earth. But hope has a cruel edge. When the pits came up empty, the men did not blame the island. They blamed each other. Someone must have misread the signs. Someone must be holding back the real map. Trust dissolved with every false lead. In 1922, one journal recorded a chilling scene. "We argued until our voices were hoarse. The maps are lies, I am certain now. But still we dig, for without them, what are we? To leave would mean we wasted our lives." The irony was brutal. The maps which were supposed to guide them to freedom chained them to the island instead. Each one promised salvation, but each one delivered despair, and still they clung to them, because belief was the only thing left. Think about that. Imagine tearing through dense rainforest for days, your body aching, your skin torn by thorns, all because a line of faded ink told you that treasure lay beneath your feet. Imagine digging for weeks, your fingers raw, your stomach empty, only to find nothing but stone. Would you stop? Or would you convince yourself that the next map, the next clue, the next pit would finally be the one? This was the trap of Cocos. It wasn't just the jungle that imprisoned them, it was their own hope. The maps were not guides. They were bait, and like fish hooked on a line, the men couldn't resist, even as the island reeled them in deeper. By the time 17 years had passed, their maps were torn, their myths exhausted, and their hopes broken. And yet, some of them still whispered, even as they left, "The treasure is there. Someone will find it. If not us, then another." And that's why Cocos still waits, because every false hope planted another seed for the future. Another expedition, another generation of dreamers, another lifetime lost to the promise of gold that may never have existed at all. On Cocos Island, death was never far away. It lurked in the shadows of the jungle, in the stagnant pools of water, in the raging storms that lashed the coast. For the men who stayed those 17 years, survival wasn't guaranteed. Each sunrise was borrowed time. The jungle claimed its victims first. Digging through wet, unstable ground was dangerous. Pits collapsed without warning, burying men alive beneath tons of mud and rock. One record from 1917 describes how a man vanished in an instant, swallowed by the earth he had been digging for weeks. The others clawed at the soil, screaming his name, but the jungle gave nothing back. His grave was the very hole that was supposed to deliver them fortune. And then came the fevers. The island was a breeding ground for disease. The endless rain left behind stagnant pools where mosquitoes thrived. Malaria spread like fire. Men woke drenched in sweat, shivering in the tropical heat, their bodies wasting away while others dug on. Dysentery followed, striking without mercy, leaving men too weak to stand, too dehydrated to work. With no doctors, no medicine, they could only watch each other fade. By 1920, more than one grave had been dug, not for treasure, but for friends. The sea, too, demanded its price. The waters around Cocos were treacherous. Sharp reefs waited beneath the waves, ready to shred boats to splinters. Sudden storms rose without warning, tossing ships like toys. More than one supply run ended in disaster. Survivors who swam back to shore spoke of comrades dragged under by waves, their cries silenced in seconds. Others were never seen again, swallowed by the Pacific, their bones claimed by the deep. And yet, what may have been the cruelest deaths of all were the slow ones, the deaths of despair. Men who gave everything to the hunt, only to realize after years that the treasure might never have been there. One journal from 1924 records the haunting words of a man who wrote, "I do not fear the sea or the fevers. I fear the silence. I fear waking tomorrow to dig again and find nothing." Death on Cocos wasn't always sudden. Sometimes it was stretched across months, even years, as men wasted away their strength, drained by hunger, their minds broken by obsession, their hope withering under the weight of failure. And yet, the survivors did not leave, not all of them, because death itself became part of the gamble. They told themselves the gold was just one more pit away, one more storm endured, one more sacrifice made. To quit after burying friends, after losing brothers to fever, after watching men vanish into the sea, that was unthinkable. Their suffering demanded a payoff. The treasure had to exist. It had to. But Cocos Island is not kind. It never has been. And death, like the jungle, was patient. It waited, it stalked. And when it struck, it reminded every man who stayed, this island did not care about their dreams. It would claim their bodies as easily as it claimed their hopes. By the time the expedition ended, Cocos had taken more lives than it ever gave back. And still the treasure remained buried, or perhaps never existed at all. 17 years. Think about that number. Entire generations grow up in less time. Children are born, go to school and become adults in that span. Yet for the men on Cocos Island, those 17 years blurred together into one long cycle of digging, hoping and despairing. At first, every year felt like progress. In 1909, they marked their first anniversary on the island. This time next year, they told each other, "We'll be home, pockets heavy with gold." By 1911, they had mapped more tunnels, cut through deeper jungle, and convinced themselves the treasure was just beyond the next pit. But with each passing year, the island remained silent, its secrets buried, its promises unfulfilled. The waiting was the true torture. Supplies came rarely, sometimes only once or twice a year, and when storms delayed ships, hunger and desperation gnawed at their spirits. The men clung to rumors like lifelines. A sailor passing through would whisper that someone, somewhere, had once found a chest of coins on Cocos, proof, they said, that the gold was real. That tiny flicker of hope was enough to keep them from walking away. By 1915, cracks began to show. Some men left, swearing never to return. Others begged their leaders to abandon the quest, to admit defeat. But the captains of the expedition, men who had sacrificed fortunes and reputations, refused. They told their crews, "We have already given too much. To stop now would mean our suffering was wasted." And so the years dragged on. Rainy seasons flooded their camps. Dry seasons cracked the earth, turning their tunnels into dust. Graves multiplied, hope dwindled. Yet still the promise of treasure chained them to that jungle. Imagine the conversations around the fire in 1919. 17 men left, eyes hollow, bodies gaunt. "If the treasure exists," one muttered, "perhaps it doesn't want to be found." Another stared into the flames and whispered, "Or perhaps the treasure is this island's curse, keeping us here until it has taken us all." By 1926, when the last remnants of the expedition finally departed, nothing had changed. No gold, no jewels, no glittering hoard waiting beneath the soil. What they carried back instead was exhaustion, grief, and the scars of wasted years. 17 years of their lives had been traded to Cocos Island, and the island had given them nothing in return. The weight had broken them, not in one sudden blow, but slowly, like water eroding stone. The jungle had stripped away their strength. The storms had stolen their ships. The graves had stolen their brothers. And time itself, relentless, unforgiving time, had stolen their youth. 17 years, a lifetime of waiting, of believing, of clinging to a dream that never came true. And when they finally left, the island mocked them with its silence. Somewhere out there, the treasure hunters thought, maybe someone else would arrive, dig one last pit, and strike gold in the very ground they had abandoned. That thought haunted them more than any storm, any fever, or any death, because the cruelest treasure hunt of all is not the one that ends in tragedy, it's the one that never ends, the one that steals your years and leaves you with nothing but regret. It was 1926, when the last weary group of treasure hunters finally abandoned Cocos Island. After nearly 2 decades of obsession, of sweat, blood, and death, the dream had crumbled into dust. They had arrived with ships full of tools, ambition, and fire in their hearts. They left with broken bodies, empty hands, and shadows carved deep into their faces. The departure wasn't grand. There was no dramatic farewell, no defiant vow to return. It was quiet, almost shameful. The men packed what little they had left: rusted shovels, worn boots, half-decayed journals, and carried them back to the shore. Behind them, the jungle was already swallowing the scars of their labor. Trenches filled with rainwater, tunnels collapsed, and campsites disappeared beneath creeping vines. It was as if the island had been waiting to erase their presence all along. Some men wept as they boarded the final boat. Others stared blankly at the horizon, unable to accept the years they had lost. A few cursed the island, spitting into the waves as if their hatred could wound it, but most were simply silent. They had no words left. Think about the weight of that silence. 17 years of work, of hope, of sacrifice, ending in nothing. Imagine returning home after so long, facing family and friends who had waited. What could they say? We tried, but the gold wasn't there. We dug until our hands bled, and the island gave us nothing. To many, that shame was heavier than the jungle itself. Historians tell us that some of the men never truly recovered. They drifted into obscurity, working odd jobs, haunted by memories of the island. Others returned to sea, chasing smaller ventures, but always with Cocos lodged in their minds like a thorn. And a few never stopped believing. They died insisting the treasure was still there, buried just a little deeper, waiting for the right man to claim it. But for the majority, the departure from Cocos marked the end of their strength, their youth, and their faith in dreams. 17 years had been exchanged for nothing but loss. The expedition that was supposed to make them legends left them as cautionary tales instead. And yet, as their ship pulled away from the green silhouette of Cocos, a cruel thought must have burned in their hearts. What if we stopped one pit too soon? What if the next man finds? What if everything we lost was for nothing at all? That question is what makes this story so haunting. Because when they left Cocos behind, they didn't just leave empty-handed. They left with the most painful burden of all. Doubt that maybe, just maybe, the treasure was always there, laughing beneath their feet. The final departure wasn't just a physical escape from the island. It was a surrender, a broken admission that some dreams can devour you whole, and some hunts were. When we look at the 17-year odyssey on Cocos Island, it's tempting to think the men lost only time. 17 years gone forever. But the truth is, they lost far more. Time was only the surface wound. The real losses cut deeper into their health, their families, their friendships, their very souls. Start with youth. Many of these men had arrived in their 20s, strong and ambitious, their eyes lit with the fire of adventure. By the time they left in 1926, some were grey, wrinkled, and broken. Their bodies bore the marks of a battle not with enemies, but with nature itself. Years of hauling tools through mud, digging under relentless rain, and fighting fevers had drained them of vitality. 17 years is a long time to give away to the jungle, and for most it meant the prime of their lives was swallowed whole. Then there were families. Letters from home trickled in only when supply ships arrived. Weddings were missed. Children grew up without fathers. Some men returned to find their wives remarried, their children unrecognizing of the stranger who had once been their father. Imagine stepping off a ship after nearly 2 decades and realizing the world had moved on without you. That was the cruelest cut of all. They also lost brotherhood. At the start, the men were bound together by a common dream. They laughed around campfires, shared rations, told stories of what they would do with their riches. But over the years, that unity frayed. Arguments erupted over digging sites, over leadership, over whether to stay or leave. Accusations of betrayal poisoned friendships. By the end, some of the men who had once sworn loyalty to each other could barely look one another in the eye. And what about sanity? The island played tricks on their minds. The endless waiting, the sound of rain hammering the leaves night after night, the echo of storms rolling across the sea, it wore them down. Men grew paranoid, suspicious that others were hiding gold from them. Some spoke of hearing whispers in the jungle. Others simply broke, staring into the trees for hours, their minds lost to the silence. But perhaps the greatest loss was faith. Faith in themselves, faith in destiny, faith in the dream that had brought them there. 17 years of sweat and sacrifice, and the ground had given them nothing. That kind of disappointment doesn't just fade, it reshapes a man. Some never chased another dream again, too afraid of being burned. Others drowned themselves in drink, in bitterness, in regret. Think of it this way. Gold was never the only treasure at stake. These men carried something more valuable when they arrived. Their health, their families, their friendships, their hope. By the time they left, all of that was gone. Cocos Island hadn't just robbed them of wealth, it had robbed them of life itself. And that's the cruel paradox of obsession. In chasing what they thought would make them rich, they ended up bankrupt in every way that mattered. The truth is, some treasures cannot be measured in coins and jewels. And sometimes the search itself becomes the thief. 17 years on Cocos Island, when you hear that number it almost sounds impossible. Too long for men to cling to a dream, too much of a life to sacrifice for something that might not even exist. And yet they stay, through storms, through hunger, through broken bones and broken spirits. They kept digging. Why? That's the question history forces us to ask. At its core, the story of Cocos is about greed. The legends promised billions in treasure, Spanish gold, Incan relics, pirate chests, overflowing with jewels. That vision was intoxicating. It was enough to blind men to reality, to keep them swinging picks into unforgiving rock year after year. Greed is a strange fire. It burns bright, but it consumes the very hands that feed it. These men thought they were chasing freedom, wealth, and glory. In truth, greed chained them tighter than any prison. But it would be unfair to say the story is only about greed. It is also about endurance. Few humans have ever endured what they did. 17 years of struggle against a jungle that seemed alive in its hostility. They endured storms that ripped apart their shelters. They endured disease that left them feverish and shivering in the night. They endured betrayal, loss, and despair. And still they woke up every day and kept digging. That kind of resilience is rare. Even in failure, it speaks to the stubborn strength of the human spirit. And then there is the deeper lesson, the one that lingers when the details fade. Cocos reminds us that not every treasure is meant to be found. Some treasures live in the journey, in the brotherhood forged along the way, in the stories that echo long after the last spade hits the ground. The gold they sought may still lie buried beneath that island. But the real treasure is the warning their story gives us. It tells us that dreams can inspire, but they can also destroy. That hope can carry you through the darkest nights, but unchecked obsession can cost you everything. It tells us that wealth gained at the cost of your life, your family, your soul is no wealth at all. And maybe that's why the legend of Cocos continues to haunt us even today. Because deep down, we all understand what those men faced. We all chase our own treasures, success, recognition, comfort, love. We all know the pull of ambition, and we all risk losing ourselves in the search. So when you hear the story of the men who spent 17 years chasing shadows on Cocos Island, ask yourself, what treasure are you digging for? And what is it costing you? Because history isn't just about distant islands or long-lost gold. It's about us. It's about the choices we make, the obsessions we feed, and the prices we're willing to pay. And if there's one thing Cocos Island should teach us, it's this. The greatest treasure you will ever find is not buried beneath the earth. It is the life you live, the people you love, and the time you still have. History hides its deepest scars behind tales of gold and glory. But the men of Cocos Island remind us that the true cost was not measured in treasure. It was paid in years lost, families broken, and dreams shattered. Their struggle forces us to ask, what is the real price of chasing obsession? If this story shocked you or made you see history differently, drop a comment below and tell us what struck you the most. And if you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the hidden side of history.